Welcome back to Revenge Codex. My name is Amelia Davis. I'm 25 years old. And the moment I'm about to describe, I want you to picture it exactly as it happened, because nothing I say will fully prepare you for how it felt to stand in my mother's living room, in the house I grew up in, surrounded by every person who has ever loved me, and watch my husband of 6 weeks say the words that changed everything. It was a Sunday afternoon. The kind that smells like my mother's rosemary chicken and sounds like cousins arguing over the TV remote. My aunt had driven 4 hours. My grandmother was there, 81 years old, wearing her good cardigan. My sister had brought her newborn. It was supposed to be a welcome dinner, a chance for my new husband Daniel's family to properly meet mine. I had spent 3 days preparing for that afternoon. Ironed the tablecloths, made 2 desserts, arranged flowers I cut from my own garden. And then his daughter Priya, 17 years old, sharp-tongued, and utterly fearless in the way only teenagers who have never faced real consequences can be, stood up from her chair, looked directly at me in front of everyone, and said, "You're not actually part of this family. You're just something my dad picked up." The room went silent. Not the gentle kind of silence. The kind that has weight. The kind you can feel pressing against your chest. I looked at Daniel. And Daniel, my husband of 6 weeks, the man I had chosen, the man who had promised me partnership, looked at his daughter, then looked at me, and said, "Charlotte, she's just a kid. You don't have any right to make this into something. I want you to stop for a second. Where are you watching this from right now? Because I need to know someone out there understands what it feels like to be standing in your mother's home, your grandmother 2 seats away, and hear your husband tell you that you have no right. No right." I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and I said, very quietly, "You're right. Let's enjoy dinner." What no one in that room knew, what Daniel certainly didn't know, was that in that moment, something in me went completely, utterly still. Not broken. Still. And still water, as it turns out, runs very deep. Let me take you back. Because this story doesn't begin at that dinner table. It begins about 2 years earlier, in a coffee shop where I was reading a contract, and a man sat down across from me uninvited and said, "You look too young to be reading something that serious." That was Daniel Reeves. 41 years old, architect, divorced, father of 1. He was charming in the particular way that men who have been told they're charming their whole lives tend to be, effortlessly, almost accidentally. He laughed easily. He listened well. Or at least, he appeared to. I was 23 at the time. People made assumptions about me constantly. I was used to it. I'm not tall. I don't have a commanding presence in the way the world tends to define one. I'm quiet. I dress plainly. I don't fill rooms with noise. What I do have is a mind that works very quickly and very quietly, and a memory that doesn't let go of anything. I had recently passed the bar exam on my first attempt. I was working as a junior associate at a mid-size firm, handling primarily contract and estate law. I was also, quietly, finishing a master's degree in financial law on evenings and weekends. No one at the firm knew about the degree yet. I hadn't told Daniel either. When we started dating, it didn't feel relevant. I wasn't hiding it. I simply didn't think I needed to justify myself to anyone. That was, I would later understand, my first mistake in that relationship. Not the degree. The assumption that I didn't need to justify myself. Because from the very beginning, Daniel had a particular way of framing things. Small things, at first. Things you could almost convince yourself were nothing. He would introduce me at parties as my Charlotte, not my girlfriend Charlotte, not Charlotte. Who is a lawyer, just my Charlotte, like I was a possession he was fond of. When I corrected him once, gently, he laughed it off. You're so serious, he said. It's just how I talk, that sentence mattered. I didn't realize it then. But it did. He had full custody of Priya, his daughter from his first marriage. His ex-wife had moved abroad, and Priya had lived with him since she was 12. By the time I met her, she was 15, and she had built a very careful, very effective system for managing the women in her father's life. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was subtle. She would say things with a smile that landed like a small blade, a comment about my cooking, about my clothes, about something I'd said. And then she would look at her father with this particular expression, this little lift of the chin, and Daniel would laugh, or change the subject, or, and this was the part that should have told me everything, he would look at me and say, "She's just joking. She loves you, she did not love me." I knew that. But what I was slower to understand was that Daniel knew it too, and didn't care. Or more precisely, he cared about his daughter's comfort more than he cared about my dignity. And he had decided, somewhere deep and unspoken, that those two things were in competition. We dated for 18 months before he proposed. During that time I watched the dynamic carefully. I am a lawyer. Observation is not a passive act for me, it is a professional skill. I noticed patterns. I catalogued them. I told myself they were things we could work through, because I genuinely believed, that Daniel was fundamentally a good man who was simply overcompensating for his guilt about the divorce. I thought love would shift the balance. What I did not fully account for was that some balances are not shifted by love. They are shifted only by consequence. We got married in April. Small ceremony. Close family. Priya was there, dressed beautifully, smiling for photographs, and when the photographer asked her to stand next to me for a shot, she stepped slightly in front of me. It was barely noticeable. I noticed it. The first 6 weeks of marriage were a performance of normalcy. We settled into the house, Daniel's house, which I had moved into, which meant I was living in a space that had been Priya's domain for years. She had opinions about where things were placed. She moved objects I had arranged. She would walk into a room where Daniel and I were talking and simply begin speaking as though I wasn't there, and Daniel would redirect his attention to her without a pause, without an apology, without so much as a glance in my direction to acknowledge what had just happened. I started keeping notes. Not for any particular reason at first, just because I am someone who writes things down. Dates, incidents, exact words. It's a habit from work. You write it down because memory is fallible and context is everything. That wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was the quieter erosion. The way Daniel would agree with me in private and then capitulate to Priya in public. The way he would say, "You're my wife, Charlotte. Of course you come first," and then, in the very next breath, make a decision that placed me last. The gap between what he said and what he did was so consistent, so precisely maintained, that I began to understand it wasn't carelessness. It was a choice. A continuous, daily choice. I stopped reacting. I want you to mark that moment, because it's important. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It wasn't a morning I woke up and said, "Today I become strategic." It was quieter than that. It was a Tuesday evening when Priya made a comment about the way I'd reorganized the kitchen, something dismissive, something designed to make me feel like a guest in my own home, and I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest. And then I felt it cool. And I thought, no, not yet. I stopped reacting. And I started observing. What I observed was this. Daniel's entire relational architecture was built on appeasement. He had spent years managing Priya's emotions as a way of managing his own guilt. His peace was contingent on her approval. That meant that anyone who threatened her comfort threatened his peace, and anyone who threatened his peace became, in his framing, the problem. I had been cast, without my consent, as the problem. And here is what I also observed. The people around Daniel, his friends, his sister, even some of my own family who had met him, believed the version of me that he and Priya had slowly, carefully constructed. Not through outright lies, but through a steady accumulation of small impressions. Charlotte overreacts. Charlotte is sensitive. Charlotte has a hard time adjusting. Charlotte doesn't really understand family dynamics. I heard these things secondhand. I stored them. What happened next, I need you to understand, was not impulsive. It was architectural. I called my mentor from law school, a woman named Diane, who is one of the sharpest minds I have ever encountered, and who has always been unflinching in her honesty with me. I told her everything. Not emotionally. I laid it out the way I would lay out a case. Here are the facts. Here is the pattern. Here is what I need to understand. Diane listened. Then she said, Charlotte, what do you want the outcome to be? I thought about that for a long time. And the answer I arrived at was not what I expected. I didn't want revenge in the way revenge is usually imagined, hot and immediate and chaotic. What I wanted was clarity. I wanted the truth of who I was to be visible and undeniable. I wanted the people who had accepted a false version of me to have to reckon with the real one, and I wanted Daniel to understand, with absolute precision, what he had lost the right to. I finished my master's degree. I had been 3 weeks from completion when the dinner happened, which is a detail that matters. I submitted my final thesis on a Wednesday, defended it on a Friday, and received confirmation of completion the following Monday. That Monday was also the day I accepted a position, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, as a senior associate at one of the most respected estate and trust law firms in the city. It was a significant step. It came with a title change, a substantial salary increase, and this part matters, a professional reputation that was entirely mine, built before and independent of my marriage. I said yes to the job. I said nothing to Daniel. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because what I was doing was not deception. I was not hiding something that was his to know. I was building something that was mine, in the only space I had left where I was not being diminished. And I was doing it quietly because I had learned, because he had taught me, that anything I claimed in that house would be minimized, contextualized, or handed over to Priya's judgment for approval. So I built in silence. And I waited. The dinner happened 3 weeks after the Sunday I've described to you. The original Sunday, the rosemary chicken, my grandmother's good cardigan, Priya's words like small clean cuts, that was the moment I stopped reacting. But the dinner I'm about to describe now, 3 weeks later, was the moment everything shifted. My cousin Marcus had organized a gathering. He's the kind of person who collects people around him naturally. His home is always full. Always warm, always loud in the best way. He'd invited a wide group, my family, some mutual friends, a few people from his work. Daniel was there. Priya was there. And so were several people from my new firm, including my supervisor, a man named Edward who had been in family law for 30 years, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who has seen everything twice. Priya did not know who Edward was. Daniel did not know who Edward was. No one there that night knew I had started the new position, because I had not told anyone. I had simply shown up, as I always did, quietly, neatly, in a plain dress, and helped Marcus arrange the drinks table, and waited. I could feel the moment Priya decided to perform. There is a particular stillness that settles over her before she says something designed to land, a breath, a small adjustment of posture. I had catalogued that too. She was talking to a group of people near the fireplace. Daniel was beside her. Comfortable. Relaxed. I was a few feet away, in conversation with Edward and his wife, when Priya said, loudly enough to carry, "My dad's wife is actually a junior assistant somewhere. She acts like she's this serious professional, but honestly she just does paperwork." There was laughter. Not cruel laughter. Exactly the kind that comes from not knowing any better, from accepting the framing you've been handed. Daniel said nothing. And I felt Edward, beside me, go very still. I touched his arm. "Give me one moment," I said quietly. I walked to where Priya was standing. The conversation around her slowed. Daniel looked up. I said, "Priya, I'd like to introduce you to someone." I turned. "This is Edward Callahan. He's the senior partner at Callahan, Reeves, and Mitchell. I started working with him 2 weeks ago as a senior associate, specializing in estate and trust law. I finished my master's degree in financial law last month." I paused. "I thought you might like to know. Since you were just describing my career, the silence was not like the silence at my mother's table. That silence had weight. This silence had shape. It was the shape of a room full of people recalculating." Priya stared at me. Her jaw was not exactly open, but the confidence had left her face so completely, and so quickly, that what remained looked almost unfamiliar. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated than either. Something that looked, if I had to name it, like the first moment of genuine reckoning. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble. I did not perform victory. I simply returned to Edward and said, "I'm sorry about the interruption. You were saying," and Edward, bless him, 30 years of family law. He had seen everything twice, simply picked up the conversation exactly where we'd left it. And we talked for another 20 minutes while the room reassembled itself around us. What happened next was the part I had not scripted, because I don't script other people's choices. I only prepare for my own. Daniel came to find me an hour later. He was quieter than I had ever seen him, not the comfortable quiet of a man at ease, but the tight quiet of a man assembling words carefully. "You never told me," he said. "No," I said. "I didn't, why not?" I looked at him. I thought about the Sunday at my mother's house. I thought about the 18 months of, "she's just joking." I thought about my name being moved to the bottom of every silent hierarchy, every domestic negotiation, every public moment where I was reduced to an afterthought. "Because," I said carefully, "you told me I had no right." He started to say something. I let him start. And then I said, "I don't mean specifically. I mean as a pattern. Every time I tried to establish myself in your home, in your family, with your daughter, the message I received, consistently, was that I had no right to a standing. So I built one somewhere else." He was quiet for a long moment. "Charlotte, I'm not angry." "Daniel," I said. And I meant it. That was the strangest part. I was not angry. I was clear. "But I need you to understand something. I am not a junior anything. I am not someone to be managed or minimized or handed over to a teenager's approval. I am your wife. And if that means something to you, the way you've been treating me has to change." He looked at me as though he was seeing something for the first time. Maybe he was. Or maybe he was seeing something he had always known and had chosen, until now, not to look at directly. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten," he said. "Yes, you did," I said. Not unkindly. Just truthfully. "You were there." I'm going to tell you what I did next, because this is the part that might surprise you. I did not leave. Not that night. I am not telling you this is a story with a clean ending of departure and freedom, because that would be simple in a way that real life rarely is. I am telling you this is a story about what happens when someone who has been made to feel invisible becomes, simply and undeniably, visible. In the weeks after that night, things shifted. Not perfectly, nothing shifts perfectly. Priya was sullen and careful in a way she hadn't been before, like someone who has learned that the ground can give way and is now watching where she steps. Daniel began, haltingly, with the discomfort of a man unused to their exercise, to correct her when she spoke about me with contempt. The first time he did it, the first time he said, "That's not okay." Priya apologized to Charlotte. I watched her face cycle through outrage, then calculation, then a grudging, tight-lipped acknowledgement that the landscape had changed. It wasn't transformation. I won't call it that. But it was consequence. And consequence, I have learned, is the only language that certain dynamics understand. My grandmother called me 2 days after Marcus's gathering. She is 81, and she still has the directness of a woman who has lived through enough to have stopped tolerating anything unnecessary. I heard what that child said at Sunday dinner, she told me. And I saw how you handled it at Marcus's. Your grandfather would have said, "That girl doesn't make noise when she moves," she paused. That's a compliment. Charlotte, I held the phone very tightly for a moment. Thank you. Nana, I said. Don't thank me, she said. Just don't let them make you small again. I haven't. I want to tell you something about silence, because I think it's misunderstood. We are taught, women especially, that silence is submission. That if you don't fight back immediately, loudly, in the moment, you have lost something. You have allowed something. You have failed yourself. What I learned in those months was that silence can be something else entirely. Silence can be the space in which you build. Silence can be the thing that preserves your energy while others exhaust theirs. Silence can be strategic in the truest sense, not cowardly, not passive, but deliberately withheld, like a card you are waiting to play at precisely the right moment. Priya's mistake was assuming my silence was absence. She thought I wasn't there, wasn't watching, wasn't accumulating. She thought the quiet woman helping with the drinks table was simply quiet. She hadn't yet learned what I had understood from childhood. The people you underestimate don't disappear. They observe. And Daniel's mistake was believing that appeasement was the same thing as peace. He had spent years managing Priya's emotions because the alternative, holding her accountable, felt too costly, too difficult, too fraught with the guilt of a father who had watched his marriage end and had decided, somewhere in that grief, that his daughter's approval was the measure of whether he had failed her. What he didn't understand was that the peace he was buying came at a price someone else was paying. And the person paying it was me. I want you to hear this clearly. I do not blame him entirely. I think he is a man who was doing the best he understood with the tools he had, and who had convinced himself that keeping the peace and doing right by his daughter were the same thing, when in fact they were two very different things, and he had been choosing one at the expense of the other. But understanding is not the same as accepting. You can have compassion for a person's limitations and still require them to meet you differently. In the months that followed, I built. That is the word I keep returning to, build. I established myself at the firm. I took on cases. I developed a reputation for precision and calm under pressure, which my colleagues found either impressive or slightly unnerving, depending on their own relationship with conflict. I made a professional life that was so wholly and entirely mine that it could not be loaned, diminished, or handed over to anyone else's judgment. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever been in a position where the people around you had decided, before you spoke, who you were? Where the narrative about you was being written by someone else, and you were simply expected to inhabit it, to confirm it, to make yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's version of you? If the answer is yes, then you know that the way out is not an explosion. Explosions are satisfying in the moment and leave nothing standing. The way out is architecture. You build something so solid, So undeniably real, that the false structure simply cannot hold beside it. That is what I did. And I want to be honest with you. It was not easy. There were evenings in those months when I came home from the firm to a house that did not feel like mine, to a husband who was still learning how to see me, to a teenager who watched me with a complicated mixture of resentment and reluctant respect, and I sat in my car in the driveway for an extra 5 minutes, because I needed 5 minutes that were entirely my own, before I walked through that door. I allowed myself 5 minutes. And then I walked inches. There was a second moment, a public one, that I think deserves its own description, because it happened 3 months after Marcus's gathering, and it was quieter than that night, but in some ways more significant. Priya had a school function. An end-of-year presentation where students showcased projects. Daniel and I both attended. It was a normal school gymnasium, folding chairs, too warm air, the particular smell of institutional carpet and industrial cleaner. Priya's project was on urban architecture, inspired, she said in her presentation, by her father's work. She was good. I want to say that clearly, because it's true. She is a bright, sharp, capable young woman, and when she is not performing contempt, she is genuinely compelling to watch. She presented with confidence and intelligence, and I watched her with something that surprised me slightly, something close to admiration. Afterward, one of her teachers approached Daniel and me together. She said to both of us, looking between us, Priya talks about her stepmother quite a bit this year. I think the career conversations have been good for her. Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. Priya, 3 feet away, was suddenly very interested in her project display board. The teacher moved on. Daniel and I stood together in the warm gymnasium air, and he said, quietly, "She talks to you, sometimes," I said. "She has questions about the law." I answer them. He was silent for a moment. "I didn't know that. There's a lot you didn't know," I said. Not with bitterness, just with the clean edge of fact. He nodded slowly. "I'm trying to," I believed him. That was the complicated thing, I believed him. Growth is not a clean narrative. It does not arrive fully formed. It arrives the way most real things arrive. Incrementally, imperfectly, with gaps and setbacks and moments that require you to decide again. Every time, whether you are still willing to be present for it. I was. I am. But on my terms. And with the full, undisguised, entirely visible weight of who I actually am. Here is what I want to leave you with, because every story has to end somewhere, even if the life inside it continues. I am not a person who was saved by someone else. I was not rescued. No one arrived to vindicate me. No authority figure swooped in to correct the record on my behalf. What happened was quieter and more permanent than that. I vindicated myself. I built the truth of who I am in full view, and then I simply waited for the false version to dissolve beside it. Priya is 18 now. She will leave for university in the autumn. A few weeks ago, she came into the kitchen while I was reviewing a contract, late evening, everyone else already in bed, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and said, without looking directly at me, "The firm you work for. Is it hard to get an internship there?" I looked up. "For someone like me," she said. I put the contract down. "Tell me what you're interested in," I said. We talked for an hour. I will not tell you it was a transformation. I will not tell you it undid everything. But I will tell you that at one point she said, quietly and with something that sounded like actual difficulty, "I wasn't fair to you." In the beginning, I looked at her for a long moment. 17, almost 18 years old, standing in my kitchen in bare feet, asking me something real for the first time. "No," I said. "You weren't," I thought. She stopped. Started again. "I thought if you mattered, my dad would matter less to me somehow. Like there was only a certain amount," I nodded. That's understandable, I said. But it's not how it works. I know that now, she said. I won't pretend that sentence healed everything. It didn't. But I will tell you that it mattered. And I will tell you that I wrote it down. The way I write everything down, not out of resentment, but out of the deep professional habit of a woman who knows that context is everything, and that words, once spoken honestly, deserve to be remembered. Daniel and I are still in the work of becoming. I say it that way deliberately. We are not arrived. We are in the process of rebuilding something that was constructed on an uneven foundation, and rebuilding is slower and more careful and more uncertain than building for the first time. Some days are better than others. There are conversations we have now that we could not have had a year ago. Because a year ago we didn't have the vocabulary for them. I had learned to be quiet, and he had learned not to look. What changed was visibility. Mine. First, the undeniable, professional, public visibility of a woman who had been underestimated and had quietly become impossible to dismiss. But then also his, the visibility of a man who had to look. Finally, at the pattern of small surrenders he had made and what they had cost. Accountability is not comfortable, but it is the only foundation that holds. My name is Amelia Davis. I am 25 years old. I passed the bar on my first attempt, finished a master's degree in financial law while working full-time, and accepted a senior associate position at one of the most respected firms in the city, all before most people in my life thought to ask what I was working on. I stood in my mother's living room and heard my husband say I had no right. And I didn't cry. And I didn't yell. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I said, very quietly, "You're right. Let's enjoy dinner," and then I went home. And I got back to work. Because the most powerful thing you can do in a room that has decided to underestimate you is not argue. It is to make the argument irrelevant. To anyone watching this who has ever been the quiet one in the room while someone louder told your story for you, I want you to hear this. Your silence is not your weakness. It is your reserve. Guard it carefully. Build in it deliberately. And when the moment comes, and it will come, step forward and let the truth of who you are speak in the only language that cannot be argued with. Not noise. Evidence. I'm Amelia Davis. And I'm just getting started.